Speak. Take one.
Where are you from, and how did you get involved in the civil rights movement?
I grew up in rural Alabama, about 50 miles south of Montgomery. I'm the third child in a family of 10. The little place where I grew up is so small, it's very difficult to locate it on the map, on the Alabama map. Martin Luther King Jr. used to refer to this place as being Four Corners, Alabama. It's near a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, and later, when I was 4 years old in 1944, he had saved something like $300. And with those $300, we moved from the plantation, and he bought 110 acres of land where my family were able to raise cotton, corn, peanuts, chickens. So it's part of my growing up. It was primarily in rural Alabama.
How did you get involved in civil rights activities?
Well, as a young child growing up in rural Alabama, I saw the system of segregation and racial discrimination. We had to attend school in a one-room church from the first through the 6th grade, and we had the books that were handed down from white students by the county.
Cut. Speed.
2. Okay. I guess we were talking about how you got involved in civil rights movements, and you were saying you started out in growing up. You're talking about what happened to you when you were growing up.
Well, as I was growing up in rural Alabama, I saw all around me the system of segregation and racial discrimination. The visible signs in the little town of Troy, the population about 7,000, we saw the sign that said colored only, white only, colored waiting, water fountain. In a little 5 and 10 store, there was a silver fountain, a clean fountain for white people to come and drink water. But in another corner of the store, there was a little spigot, a rusted spigot, said colored drinking. And I became resentful of the signs and all the visible evidence of segregation and racial discrimination. My father and my uncles and my grandfather and great-grandfathers on my mother's side and my father's side, all of my relatives, I listened to their discussions about what had happened to them. And so I grew up in that environment where I had to face and live with the system every day. And I don't think I had much of a choice but to resent it. And I grew up with a feeling that I had to find a way to oppose the system of segregation and racial discrimination. You know, my responsibility on the farm was to raise the chicken. We had a lot of chickens. And I grew up with this idea somehow, I don't know where it came from. I wanted to be a minister, and somehow I transferred my desire to be a minister and my responsibility of raising the chicken, somehow it got together. And I literally started preaching to the chickens. They became members of this sort of invisible church, or maybe you want to call it a real church. And I tried out certain ideas on the chickens. And later I tested certain ideas on my younger brothers and sisters and first cousins. And I remember my first act of maybe a nonviolent protest was when my parents would kill the chicken, that I would refuse to eat the chicken, and went for 2 or 3 days refusing to speak to my mother, father, because they killed the chicken. I thought it was so wrong. But one thing I did as a young child when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I wanted to save the soul of a chicken, and baptized this particular chicken, and the chicken drowned. And in the process of trying to save this chicken, I lost the chicken. But that's, I guess, my sort of childhood way of dealing with protests and getting involved in later the civil rights movement. I was 15 years old in the 10th grade in 1955 when I first heard of the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, Montgomery is only 50 miles from where I grew up. And I heard about Martin Luther King because he came on a local radio station for Montgomery, and he was preaching sermons like most black Baptist ministers. But I heard of this man and the sermons, eloquent. But one sermon he had, it was very special one Sunday morning at 11 o'clock on this radio station. It was something called Paul's message to the church at Corinth, but he took this sermon around and made it something like Paul's letter or Paul's message to the Christians of America. And he kept preaching about, he was not concerned about the streets of heaven and the pearly gates and the streets paved with milk and honey. He was more concerned about the streets of Montgomery and the way that black people and poor people were being treated in Montgomery. And this was before December 1955, when the Montgomery bus boycott occurred. And I think listening to Martin Luther King Jr. and listening to my grandmother and grandfather about some of the things that had happened to them became messages, became the necessary ingredients to encourage me to identify with whatever movement or organization or cause that would rock the whole system of segregation and racial discrimination. We were bused to school after I left the 6th grade. We rode in old broken down buses that white children had used. We didn't have any new buses. And the roads, even the roads in the black community where black people own land, were unpaved. They were left literally, deliberately unpaved. They even skipped places in the road. And during the winter months, we were running ditches on the way to school because of the rain, the red mud, and the clay in that part of Alabama. And during evenings, returning from school, we would be late returning home because the bus would break down, we'd get stuck in the mud, and that type of thing. So all of these things came together. And by the time I went away to college in 1957, and I was away from home, and the Montgomery bus boycott had occurred in Montgomery, where we had witnessed, and I saw it on television, I read about it in the newspaper. We didn't even have a subscription, as a matter of fact, because we was too poor, I guess, to the local daily newspaper, something called the Montgomery Advertiser. But my grandfather had a subscription to that paper, and each day after he read the paper, we would get the paper, and we kept up with what was happening in Montgomery. And we listened to the radio. And what happened in Montgomery, to watch 50,000 black people walk the streets for over a year rather than ride segregated buses, became a source of inspiration. It created a sense of hope, a sense of optimism. And by going to school in Nashville, Tennessee, many, many miles away from my parents and from rural Alabama, I felt freer to find a way to get involved. And one of the first things I did, I became a member of the youth chapter of the NAACP in Nashville. As a matter of fact, I tried to organize a campus chapter on the campus of the American Baptist Theological Seminary when I was a student. We didn't succeed in that effort because this little school was jointly supported by the Southern Baptist Convention, which is, for the most part, during that period, was all white, and the National Baptist Convention. And the president of the school said we couldn't organize a chapter there. But I continued to be involved in the local chapter.
How did you get involved in the sit-ins in Nashville?
Well,
and how did those sit-ins start in Nashville?
During the school year of 59, 60, well, even before then, there was a group of students in Nashville who had attended a summer workshop at Holland Folk School outside of Nashville on a little.
Okay. Camera roll 2.
Okay,
Speed.
I am. Move your hands out a little bit more. I mean, out forward. Right there. Okay, Henry, I'm fine.
Okay. So what you're saying is that you were prepared for the sit-ins?
Yes, I think we were prepared in Nashville. Nashville at the time was considered sort of the citadel of education in the South, with all of the colleges and all of the universities there, and many churches, sort of progressive and liberal. There was a very active social action committee at one of the local black Baptist churches. And at the same time, the pastor of this church, the Reverend Kelly Miller Smith, was the local president of the Nashville Christian Leadership Council, an arm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had an effort going. So every Tuesday night for our entire semester of 1959, we had what we call nonviolent workshop, direct action workshop, where we discussed and debated the theory, the philosophy of Gandhi, the teaching of Gandhi, the whole question of civil disobedience, the whole history of the struggle in India, and the attempt on the part of Gandhi to bring about some resolution of the problems in South Africa. But the point came rather, I guess, halfway through the workshop in late November and early December of 59 to have a few test sit-ins. So we organized a delegation of young people, primarily students, white students, black students, international students primarily from Africa and from some of the Latin American countries. We went down to 2 of the large department stores and occupied the lunch kind of seats, went into restaurants, and occupied seats at tables, and we were told that we could not be served because there were blacks in the groups. This established the case that the city of Nashville was segregated, that they refused to serve black people. We continued the workshop, but when we returned during the early part of 1960, we did receive a call from a young minister by the name of Douglas Moore. This was after the Greensburg sit-ins of February 1st, 1960, saying, what can the students in Nashville do to support the students of North Carolina? And I guess that was the message, that was the question that we needed. And we were ready. We were ready to be involved, to organize mass sit-ins or sit-down demonstration in Nashville. So in a matter of 2 or 3 days, we organized during the month of February what we call T-Days and Saturday sit-in. On most of the college campuses in Nashville, Tuesdays and Thursdays were light days for classes, and Saturday, for the most part, was a free day. We had on that first day over 500 students together in front of Fisk University chapel to be transported downtown to the First Baptist Church to be organized into small groups to go down to sit in at the lunch counter. We went in.
Okay.
3.
We went into the local stores, for the most part, the 5 and 10, Woolworth, Kresge's, McClellan's. These stores were known all across the South, and for the most part, all across the country. We took our seats in a very orderly, peaceful fashion. The students were dressed like they were on the way to church, going to a big social affair. But they had their books, and we stayed there at the lunch counter studying and preparing our homework because we were denied service. The manager ordered that the lunch counters be closed, that the restaurants be closed. We just sit there, and we continue to sit all day long. The first day, nothing in terms of violence or any disorder, nothing happened. This continued for a few more days, and it continued day in and day out. And finally, on one Saturday, when we had about 100 students prepared to go down, it was a very beautiful day in Nashville, very beautiful day. We got a call from a local white minister who had been a real supporter of the movement. He said that if we go down on this particular day, he understands that the police would stand to the side and let a group of white hoodlums and thugs come in and beat people up, and then we will be arrested. And we should make a decision whether we wanted to go or not. And some people tried to discourage us from going on that particular Saturday. We made a decision to go, and we all went to the same store. It was Woolworth in downtown Nashville, in the heart of the downtown area, and occupied every seat at the lunch counter, every seat in the restaurant. And it did happen. A group of young white men came in, and they started pulling and beating primarily the young women, putting lighted cigarettes down their backs and their hair, and really beating people. And in a short time, police officials came in and placed all of us under arrest, and not a single member of the white group, the people that were opposing our sitting down at the lunch counter, were arrested. We all left out of that store singing, "We Shall Overcome." This was the first arrest in the Nashville city. It was the first mass arrest, I think, any place in the South. I believe it was February the 27th, 1960. And
Was that the first time you were arrested?
it was the first time that I was arrested. And growing up in the rural South, it was not the thing to do, not to go to jail. It would bring shame and disgrace on the family. But for me, I tell you, it was like being involved in a holy crusade. It became a badge of honor. I felt good about it. And I think it was in keeping with what we had been taught in the workshops. So I felt very good in a sense of righteous indignation about being arrested, but at the same time, the commitment and dedication on the part of the students.
Let's run out. 2. Speed.
Second picture. Okay. Maybe you can tell me about the day that Alexander Luby's house was bombed.
Well, it was early one morning, about 6 o'clock. Z. Alexander Luby, who had been a strong supporter and defender of civil rights, a member of the city council, the first black member of the city council in the city of Nashville. He was a NAACP Legal Defense Fund lawyer. He had been the legal counsel for all of the students that had participated in the city and had brought some of the original school desegregation cases and worked with Thurgood Marshall. We heard that his house had been bombed, and all across the city, on the different college campuses, we had a similar reaction to call a meeting of the Nashville Central Committee. The Central Committee was the executive committee of the Nashville Student Nonviolent Movement. by, I would say between 6:30 and 7 o'clock, we were meeting. Shortly after 7, we had sent the mayor a telegram saying to the mayor that we would have a march on City Hall. And the mayor was Ben West, was the mayor's name, to protest the bombing of Attorney Luby's house. By noon, we had more than 5,000 students from Tennessee State, Fisk University, American Baptist Theological Seminary, Meharry, and Vanderbilt, and people from the community with a sense of righteous indignation. It was not a noisy march. It was very orderly, and people marched in twos. It was a long march, but it was one of the most beautiful efforts on the part of the student community and the people of Nashville to say to the mayor, say to the business community that we wanted to protest the bombing, but we wanted to see the city of Nashville become a desegregated city, an open city. And I'll never forget that day when we met at City Hall. Diane Nash, as the chairperson of the Nashville Student Movement, met the mayor when he walked out to greet all of us, and she said something like, "Mr. Mayor, do you favor desegregation of the lunch counters?" And he said something like, "Yes, yes, young lady, I favor desegregation of the lunch counter. It's left up to the businessmen." And the Nashville Tennessean, which is I guess a progressive, moderate newspaper in Nashville and in the South, he had a banner headline the next day saying something to the effect, "Mayor favor desegregation of the lunch counters." And from that day on, it was down road, I guess, it was an easy task for us to negotiate with the merchants, with the Chamber of Commerce, to end segregation at all of the lunch counters, in drugstores, in variety stores, the 5 and 10, and most of the restaurants in downtown Nashville. But it was not.
Was it a natural thing then for you to get involved in the Freedom Rides?
Yeah, I think it was natural. It was part of. It was natural for me personally, because I had traveled almost 3.5 years from Alabama, from southeast Alabama, through Montgomery, through Birmingham, to Nashville to attend school by bus. And I had seen the sign saying white only, colored only, waiting. In Troy, we didn't have a bus station, but we had an area for colored people, where colored people were supposed to wait, where they had colored waiting. That black people had to stand in a line saying colored waiting to buy a ticket, and then come back around and get in at the front of the bus and go to the back of the bus. That was on the Greyhound bus. So the Freedom Ride was an attempt to end segregation, to end racial discrimination on the buses throughout the South. It was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, that had issued a call for the Freedom Ride. And I was one of the persons, as a member of the Nashville Student Movement, to volunteer to become a participant on the Freedom Ride. And I remember very well, this was early spring of 1961. But in the meantime, we were involved in another effort in Nashville to desegregate the lunch counters. Not the lunch counters, but the theaters. See, all of the theaters in Nashville was segregated. Still segregated in 61. We had 13 stand-in, 13 consecutive days of stand-in, where we literally stood in, kept white people from going into the theaters, because black people had to buy their ticket in a separate window, go in a separate door, and go upstairs and sit in something we refer to as the buzzard roost. We couldn't sit on the main floor. So we had this stand-in, and after 13 days of stand-in, the theaters in Nashville desegregated. But while that was all going on, while the stand-in was taking place, it was this appeal to go on the Freedom Ride. And I believe the Freedom Ride started in the first week in May 1961. in Washington, D.C. As a matter of fact, on the night of May 3rd, 1961, this group of 13 Freedom Riders, 7 whites and 6 black, had a dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Washington, D.C. It was my first time having Chinese food. Someone growing up in the South and going to school in Nashville never had Chinese food. But we had attended a few days of workshops, had some discussion with then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. We met at something called the Fellowship House in Washington. And this meal was to me, it was like the Last Supper because you didn't know what to expect going on the Freedom Ride. We had been told to expect same things in parts of Georgia, same things in parts of Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana. And I remember getting on the bus, coming to Washington, I guess by plane, and getting on the bus at the Greyhound bus station in Washington, D.C. on May 4th. And I had for my seatmate was an elderly white gentleman named Albert Bigelow. Albert Bigelow was from Cobb's Cobb, Connecticut. He was a pacifist. He had been the skipper on a little ship called the Golden Rule out in the South Pacific, protesting against the testing atomic bomb. He was a very committed guy to the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. And so we got on this ride through the South. We went into parts of Virginia, to Lynchburg, Petersburg, and other places, and without any problems. Through North Carolina, one of the riders attempted to get a shoe shine and a haircut in a so-called white barber shop in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was arrested and went to court the next day, and the judge threw the case out. We went on to Rock Hill, South Carolina, and Albert Bigelow and myself got off the bus, and we started in a so-called white waiting room. The doors of the waiting room was marked white waiting, and we started in the door, and we were met by a group of white young men that beat us and hit us, knocked us out, left us lying on the sidewalk there in front of the entrance to the waiting room. And in a matter of a few minutes, a group of Rock Hill police officials came up and wanted to know whether we wanted to press charges, and we said no. I left the ride the next day, and I had to fly to Philadelphia for an interview with the American Friends Service Committee, because I had applied to go abroad as a volunteer in an international program in what then was Tanganyika, Tanzania now. And I had planned to rejoin the ride in Birmingham on Mother's Day. I don't remember the date, but it was the second Sunday in May. But the riders never really made it to Birmingham, because one of the bus that I would have been on, after it made it through Georgia, it arrived in Anniston, Alabama, and on the outside of Anniston, Alabama, this bus was burned, the tires were deflated, and the riders were beaten. And other riders that made it to Birmingham on a trailway bus were beaten there in Birmingham. And so I went back to Nashville, and CORE decided to drop the Freedom Ride, to end the ride in Birmingham. And it was Bobby Kennedy, as the Attorney General of the United States, who said that there should be a cooling off period and the ride shouldn't continue. Those of us in Nashville, as a student from Nashville and who had been a participant in the early ride, felt that the ride should continue.
Run out.
Okay, so what happened in Anniston?
Well, in Anniston, Alabama.
You want to explain it? Put your hands out. Okay.
Second sticks.
So what happened in Anderson?
In Anderson, Alabama, the Greyhound bus carrying a group of the Freedom Riders was burned. The tires was deflated, and the bus just couldn't roll. And hoodlums, members of the Klan, came on the bus, pulling people out, beating people, and all of the people had to leave the burning bus, and people were left lying on the highway from being beaten by members of the Klan. And in Birmingham, when the Trailway group arrived, they were beaten, and one gentleman needed something like 53 stitches to close up the wound on his head from the beating that occurred there. After the Birmingham incident, then Attorney General Robert Kennedy said there must be a cooling off period, and he tried to discourage any more so-called freedom rides into the South. But as one of the participants in the original effort, and as someone who had been involved in the Nashville student movement, I felt and others felt that the ride should continue. We got the necessary resources to continue the ride from Nashville. We went from Nashville to Birmingham, and outside of Birmingham, two other riders that were sitting near the front of the bus, I think on maybe the very first seat behind the bus driver, were arrested and taken to jail. The other riders, we were taken into the city and later into a waiting room. And later, the Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, told us, at least informed us, that we were being taken to jail. We were not being arrested, but we were being placed in protective custody for our own safety, for our own well-being. We went to jail that Wednesday night, May 17th, 1961. We stayed in jail Thursday night. We went on a hunger strike, fast. We refused to eat anything, refused to drink any water. And early Friday morning, I would say about 2 o'clock Friday morning, Bull Connor, several members of the Birmingham police force came to our cell, took us out of the jail, and said, in effect, that they were taking us back to the college campuses in Nashville. And we got in the car. We didn't go in a voluntary way. We went limp, so they literally picked us up and put us in the car. And we started back up the highway toward the Tennessee state line. It was about 120 miles from Birmingham, and maybe about the same distance from Nashville, that they literally dropped us out on the highway near a railroad crossing and said a bus will be coming along or a train will be coming along and you can make your way back to the city of Nashville. We were frightened. We didn't know anyone in Otmore, Alabama, Otmore, Tennessee, and we went across the railroad tracks with our baggage and came upon the house of an elderly black couple. They had to be at least 70s, in their early 70s. And they were afraid to let us in, but they did. And when daylight came, the man went and bought food from several different places because he didn't want to indicate in any way that he had some unwanted guests in this small town. And the people had heard on the radio about the Freedom Riders from Nashville going to Birmingham. In the meantime, we made a telephone call to the headquarters of the Nashville Student Movement and spoke to Diane Nash, who was the leader of the effort there, and told her what had happened. And she said, what do you want to do? Do you want to come back to Nashville, or do you want to go back to Birmingham and continue the ride? And we told her that we wanted to continue the ride. She sent a car to pick us up, and she informed us that 10 other packages had been shipped by other means. She was suggesting or telling us through a code that 10 other Freedom Riders had left by train to join us in Birmingham. See, the people in Nashville and around the country thought we were still in jail, and other people were going to come to Birmingham and go on from Birmingham to continue the ride. We got in this car, in the car ride, 7 of us and the driver, got back to Birmingham and met with Fred Shuttleworth and some local people and student, particularly one student, Ruby Doris Smith, who made it from Atlanta and Selma College to join the ride. And we attempted to get on a bus about 5:30 p.m. And this bus driver said, I will not drive. And he said something like, I will never forget what this bus driver said. He said, I have only one life to give. It was a classic statement. I have only one life to give, and I'm not going to give it to the NAACP, not to CORE. This was a white bus driver in Birmingham, Alabama. Didn't have any black bus drivers at that time. In the meantime, we understood from some of the reporters that Robert Kennedy was negotiating with the officials of Greyhound to get the bus, at least to get us out of Birmingham during that night. And Robert Kennedy kept asking Greyhound officials, did they have any then Negro bus drivers? And they kept saying no. We tried at 8:30 throughout the night to get a bus, and we didn't get a bus. No bus driver would drive because the bus drivers were literally afraid of what could happen, because the Klan had surrounded the bus station. They were throwing stink bombs. There were police officials there trying to keep the Klan from getting to us inside of this so-called white waiting room. They had the police dogs. But it was not until 8:30 Saturday morning, May 21st, that we understood that an arrangement had been worked out where between the Justice Department and the officials of Greyhound and the officials of the state of Alabama, where we would board the bus with other customers or passengers, and there would be 2 officials of Greyhound. A private plane would fly over the bus. There would be a state patrol car every 15 or 20 miles along the highway between Birmingham and Montgomery, about 90 miles. We got on the bus, and a great many of the riders really literally took a nap. They went to sleep. I took a seat on the front seat right behind the driver with a young man by the name of Jim Spur, a young white guy. I was a spokesman for this particular group of riders. And we did see the plane, but I would say about 40 miles or less from the city of Montgomery, all sign of protection disappeared. There was no plane, no patrol car. And when we arrived at the bus station, it was just an eerie, just a strange feeling. It was so quiet, so peaceful, nothing. And the moment, literally, the moment we started down the steps off of that bus, an angry mob that grew into about 2,000 to 3,000 people came out of nowhere. Men, women, children, with baseball bats, club, chains, and they literally, there was no police official around, they just started beating people. And we tried to get all of the women on the ride into a taxi cab. And there was one cab there, and this driver said he couldn't take the group because it was an interracial group. We had black and white women in this particular group. And one of the Freedom Riders was a young black female student, said something like, well, I would drive myself. I would drive the cab. And the driver said no. But finally, the driver did drive off with all of the black women, and the white women started running down the street. And then the mob literally turned on the media, on members of the press. There was one cameraman, I believe, from NBC, had one of these heavy, old pieces of camera equipment on his shoulder a member of the mob took this equipment, bashed this guy, literally knocked him down, bashed his face in. So they beat up all of the reporters. Then they turned on the black male members and white male members of the group. I was beaten. I think I was hit with a soda crate thing that holds soda balls, and left lying in the street, unconscious there, in the streets of Montgomery. And I literally thought it was the last march. It was the last freedom ride. It was a very bloody event. It was a very nasty mob. There were other people that was beaten. An aide to President Kennedy who tried to intervene, get between them.
Run out. On 4. Speed.
You're rolling off for.
Okay.
5.
Okay, so how did people get away that night?
Well, after the dust settled from the violence that had occurred in Montgomery, there was no.
No, sir.
Okay.
That's not how it works.
Speed. 5.
Okay. Why didn't you want to talk to the FBI?
Well, we had some real reservation about communicating with the FBI. We had heard from what I had seen, that for the most part, they spent most of their time taking pictures, taking notes, and we felt that they were somehow part of the local police establishment, that they were friends of the local police chief or the police commissioner, the public safety commissioner, and we didn't trust the local FBI. Most of the FBI agents in Montgomery on that particular day apparently were from Birmingham, Mobile, and other parts of the South. And we had received a suggestion from, I guess, John Doe, who then was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil rights, and he has suggested to us that we shouldn't talk to anyone before we were interviewed by him.
There was a early